Good, evil. What is the line drawn between the two? The most important question a person can ask in their lifetime is, how do we distinguish between right and wrong? And so with that, I decided to embark on a journey that further explored this topic. I can now confidently say that this is probably one of the most important projects I think I've ever worked on in my life. That question requires us to peer deep into ourselves and discover a dark reality woven into the fabric of our identity. A reality we must come to terms with if we are to do good in our lives. Nalini Singh said, "To fight evil, you have to understand the dark." And anyone who has lived a little knows that there exists a darkness to life, a darkness that many find hard to cope with and even understand. Horrible things have happened throughout human history, unthinkable acts of evil that many find easier to ignore or to forget than to acknowledge and understand. And for the sake of our world and all that exists in it, we owe it to the generations of tomorrow to give this topic serious consideration and act accordingly. Full disclosure here, I am speaking from a Christian worldview, which means I believe in absolute truth and I believe that there is hope. My faith compels me to see beyond myself and seek out a higher power in the person of Jesus Christ. To see life on earth as something that is beautiful, regardless of its seemingly dilapidated state, because of the hope that is within me. In the book of Romans, chapter 15:13, it says, "May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, so that by the power of the Holy Spirit you may abound in hope." It is integrated into the Judeo-Christian worldview to do on earth as it is in heaven, to be conduits of justice, peace, and restoration. I hope that this material will leave you not discouraged, but to draw you closer to the truth and to see the light of tomorrow. There's a belief called technological utopianism, which is based on the premise that advancements in both science and technology will usher in a utopian worldview without human suffering. This position rests in the assumption that we would, in our developments, use what we have invented and learned to better humanity. The 20th century would very quickly do away with this notion, as we would see the same self-destructive tendencies of our violent past repeat itself amidst the pinnacle of the Industrial Revolution in scientific and philosophical understanding. Instead of rocks, swords, bows, and arrows, we devised guns, bombs, and chemical weapons. We didn't eradicate the evil. We became more efficient at it. We perfected it. I want to be clear on something. I am not saying that all breakthroughs were used for evil. Incredible things have been done to improve life for mankind as a result of our advancements. However, it is a far, far cry from the utopian world envisioned by earlier enlightened minds. In studying the many atrocities executed in the 20th century, from the Soviet gulags, Cambodian killing fields, Chinese Red Army, the many genocides, and of course both of the world wars, I looked into my own heart and asked the horrifying question: how distant am I from the very thing that I've come to vilify? To answer that question, I sought the answer to another. How does one create a monster out of a man? And not just any person, but an ordinary, everyday, normal human in society. Is it even possible? Or are evil people popping in and out of existence separate from the rest of an inherently good species? There was a social experiment called the Stanford Prison Experiment, conducted by Philip Zimbardo and his colleagues in 1971. The purpose of the experiment was to find out whether the brutality reported among guards in American prisons was due to the sadistic personalities of the guards or had more to do with the prison environment itself. Random people were selected to play the role of either a prison guard or play an inmate. The prison guard impersonators were given spiffy uniforms, high boots, and could wear sunglasses if they chose to. The end result of the experiment was disturbing. Guards generally broke into 3 groups in this experiment. The first group they were kind-hearted. When they thought no one was looking, they performed small random acts of kindness for the inmates. Okay, so that's number 1. Number 2, there were some that operated within the prescribed rules. Okay, so there you go. Number 3, the third group, who were considered to be, I quote, inventive, dominating, creative torturers. They thought of extra ways to assert their domination and put the prisoners into their place. They became intoxicated with the power given to them, and they became abusers. The experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks, but it was called off after 6 days because it was spinning out of control. It was shocking to see people change simply due to the title that they had been given. There was another experiment called the Milgram experiment, named after Stanley Milgram, a Yale psychologist. The crude experiment was simply to see how far random, ordinary people would go to inflict pain on another random person, even to the point of betraying their own conscience, simply because they were told to by a person in authority. So, the way it worked was, a volunteer was told by a man in a lab coat that they were to press a button that would deliver an electric shock to the person in another room if they answered a question incorrectly. There was a series of questions being asked in a progression of buttons in front of the volunteers. The buttons went from 1 to 10 in a progression of more intense electric shocks as more incorrect answers were given. This, of course, would lead to more painful reactions from the person in the other room, each one becoming more disturbing and violent. What the button-pressing person didn't realize is that the electric shocks were fake, and both the electrocuted volunteer and the man in the lab coat asking the questions were both actors. Many of the volunteers struggled with the prospect of inflicting so much pain, even torture, to another person for simply answering the wrong question. But in every case was reassured by the person in the lab coat that the data would be used to further scientific understanding. And as a result, most volunteers continued torturing an innocent individual as an ordinary, everyday person off the street. 65% delivered the highest level of electric shock available to the person, regardless of the desperate and disturbing shrieks and cries of the actor pretending to be tortured. The conclusion of these experiments showed that when people are unable to change their uncomfortable circumstances, they begin to change what they believe. Let me repeat that. When people are unable to change their uncomfortable circumstances contrasting their personal morals, they begin to change what they believe. The findings revealed that as a coping mechanism, the oppressors changed their values that caused their discomfort, which in turn was used to justify their immoral actions. Their findings hint towards a nature that contrasts the predominant belief that all humans are inherently good. That if we behave badly, it's always because we are victims of corrupt social influences. We now know that this is not true. Through the Bible, we learn that we are independent moral agents who make moral decisions, and that we must accept responsibility for the choices that we make. Joshua 24:15 says, "But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, or the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." It is only from this position of depravity that we actually find a need for an external hope for an internal problem. In 1960, special agents discovered one of the twisted minds behind the Holocaust. He was living in South America. His name was Adolf Eichmann. They put him on trial in Israel, where they called forward many former concentration camp prisoners as witnesses to the horrors that Eichmann created. One small man named Yehiel Donner miraculously lived through Auschwitz, a nightmare of a Nazi death camp located in Poland. Yehiel entered the courtroom and locked eyes for the first time with Adolf Eichmann, sitting there behind the bulletproof glass. He had never seen Adolf before. He was just the recipient of his diabolical torture. A man who murdered Donner's friends, personally executed a number of Jews, and presided over the slaughter of millions more. Out of nowhere, Yehiel collapsed on the floor, weeping and screaming. How does one process the divide between good and evil? Especially from the vantage point of Mr. Donner. Evil is often used to describe the plans and actions carried out by so many Germans in World War II in the Nazi efforts to eradicate Jewish people from existence. I read a fascinating book that helped me understand the psychology of people who executed these unthinkable war crimes. The book is titled Ordinary Men, written by Christopher R. Browning. In this book, we studied 210 men from a German battalion who were interviewed in the 1960s by two lawyers in regards to their Nazi crimes. These were not soldiers. These were ordinary men in this battalion. And I cannot stress the importance of that enough. This is vital to understand. This was a group of everyday ordinary men from Hamburg, Germany, who were drafted into a police battalion that would have to do the unthinkable acts of terror. They performed the detestable orders of the Third Reich in order to save the emotional and psychological well-being of the actual German military. We often assume that it was the Nazi soldiers doing all of the slaughtering, but in fact, the majority of it was mandated for local civilians and German society to achieve. The book says there was a constant tendency to assign the actual shooting duties of these units in order to shift the psychological burden from the German police to their collaborators. Does that shock you? It shocked me. It disturbed me because it further closed the gap between me and the very monsters that I have grown to detest. Did you know that half of the victims of the Holocaust were killed face to face executed by gunfire, not bombs dropped at a distance, and to my shock, executed by ordinary, everyday people. People who became the most efficient killing machine the world has ever witnessed. The book goes on to say, the majority of them held typical Hamburg working class jobs. Dock workers and truck drivers were most numerous, but there were also many warehouse and construction workers, machine operators, seamen, and waiters. About 35% were lower middle class, virtually all of them white-collar workers. There is no simple answer to the question, why? Why did they do it? I wish there was. I wish we could just quantify it and say, let's not do that. Ordinary people were simply following orders as they were industrializing mass murder. The mental toll was too much for the Nazi soldiers to bear. The generals needed them to be clear-minded and focused on killing the enemies that actually shot back. An interesting fact is that the men were all given the offer to leave if they didn't feel up to the task. This is contrary to popular belief. There's not one shred of evidence showing that any German soldier was punished for not shooting Jews. Think about that for a second. Creating monsters is disturbingly easy. It isn't complicated. The first thing you do, one driving factor, is thinking in terms of groups. Groups instead of individuals. Killings were always done in units in World War II, making atrocities a group task. Anyone with a cursory knowledge of Marxism knows the importance of group identity. All people are divided into groups. Prison guards and prisoners, rich and poor, Jew, Gentile, Hutus, Tutsis, etc., etc., etc. Number two, to create a monster, there is a necessity to dehumanize victims. Ideologically, you need to create a worldview where you are not killing other human beings. See, Nazis saw themselves as killing cockroaches. It became a sanitary cleansing campaign. It was never viewed as committing murder. Number three is creating social pressure. You must create social pressure to do the unthinkable as if it were no big deal. Reward, promote, and compliment the good, obedient comrades and put a lot of stock in being tough and get the job done. Obviously, this doesn't happen overnight because mass formation must have some footing in reality. But following these simple steps can ideologically subvert a large group of people, changing people's perceptions of reality and creating monsters out of ordinary people. Germany is unlike most cases in history in that it conducted barbaric acts of genocide as a modern, educated, scientifically and technologically advanced society. It is imperative that we learn from history and anchor ourselves to what is good. Peter Kraft, a professor of philosophy at Boston College, said, "The very existence of morality proves the existence of something beyond nature and beyond man." This is our starting point right here, looking beyond material nature of life and into something deeper. Moral laws point towards a moral law giver. One of the most honest philosophers of the 19th century is Friedrich Nietzsche, a self-identified atheist who once concluded this. He said, "What were we doing when we unchained the earth from its sun? Whether it is moving now, whether are we moving away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. You see, even Friedrich Nietzsche recognized the necessity for God. Without God, there is no moral framework for us to glean from, and so to differentiate between good and evil. It then becomes up to the individual to define their reality. Very few things are more dangerous than this. Jesus makes an outrageous statement in John 14:6 when he says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." See, Jesus makes a claim identifying himself with truth, and that to follow him is to follow truth. This paired with his miraculous ministry, crucifixion, and of course, his resurrection, act as a compelling argument towards his claim. You see, the question of good and evil is a question of sin. The scriptures say in Romans chapter 3:23 that all have sinned and all have fallen short of God's glory. And while every other belief system addresses sin in different ways, Jesus was the only person to present a cure: his body. And because he was fully God and fully human, he was the only one that could have possibly achieved this. An eternal redemption acted out in the world's most scandalous acts of grace this world has ever seen. Taking the sins of every human, past, present, and future, and nailing it to the cross through his body. 1 Peter chapter 2:24 says, "He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds we have been healed." By accepting Jesus' love, you are identifying with his sacrifice and the beneficiary of his salvation. You are no longer a slave to sin. Whoever the Son sets free, it is said that is free indeed. This act of grace, this expression of sacrificial love, possesses the only authority and power to heal humanity, to serve as a baseline, a reference point to which we navigate the human heart. This is what we call good news, because it states that through God, no matter how messed up things get here on earth, God's power is always greater than that. God's love always endures, and one day pure justice will be expressed through God, and all the wrong things will be made right. That is what hope looks like. Many people asked the question as to why Yehiel Döner collapsed during the trial of Adolf Eichmann. Some thought it was because he was overcome with sorrow or even rage as the horrifying death camp memories bubbled over again. But in an interview on 60 Minutes, we would soon realize that this was not the case. It was in that very moment Döner realized that sin and evil are the human condition. He said, I quote, "I was afraid about myself. I saw that I am capable to do this exactly like he." You see, Adolf Eichmann did not appear to be the demonic personification of evil that Döner expected to see there that day in that courtroom. He looked and behaved as an ordinary human being, just like anyone else. Mike Wallace, the interviewer, looked into the camera after that comment and posed the horrifying question to the viewers. How was it possible for a man to act as Eichmann did? Was he a monster, a madman, or perhaps something even more terrifying? Was he normal? Normal. What is normal? How do we measure normal? It's an interesting question. Was Eichmann a normal man? But aren't we normal? It feels almost dirty even comparing ourselves to such a manifestation of evil. But if we want to get to the truth behind the human condition, we must. We must peer into the mirror and be honest with ourselves. If we fail to come to terms with the fragility of the human mind and the compromising nature of our will, we won't be able to identify the markers that reveal the evil around ourselves and from within ourselves. And we will be doomed to repeat preventable atrocities in a world we are called to be a light in, a beacon of hope in, a conduit of healing through the message of Jesus' salvation. Friedrich Nietzsche predicted that because God had died in the 19th century, there would be two direct results in the 20th century. He said, first, the 20th century would become the bloodiest, most catastrophically destructive century in history. And second, a universal madness would break out and turn the West upside down. And unfortunately, he was right on both accounts. More blood was shed in the 20th century than all other 19 combined. And as we can see today in our postmodern philosophies, our perception of truth is completely turned upside down. Now back to my question. What would it take for an everyday, ordinary person to become a monster? The answer I discovered is the monster is already there. It is the sin nature that, when entertained, fed, and cultivated, has the power to achieve mind-bending horrors that would shock us all. The monster isn't a foreign entity. It is the nature we all possess and have the potential to become. And yet, at the same time, have the power to choose life, to experience beauty in the chaos, and experience a love so powerful it can transform the most heinous of hearts. So what will you choose?